With this short video, I want to describe exercise intensity and specifically some different ways that exercise intensity can be measured and prescribed, and even more specifically, some review maybe from anatomy and physiology or exercise physiology class, some review of blood lactate, and in this case, blood lactate as a measure of exercise intensity. And so some ideas for this are some misconceptions. And there's still misconceptions about this blood lactate or lactic acid, and the misconception that lactic acid is an anaerobic threshold. So I want to sort of describe that misconception and now what's understood about lactic acid. And then talk also about this lactate shuttle. And again, this may be review, but it's good to review because it's a marker for exercise intensity. And you probably know this acronym of FIT. So F is frequency, I is intensity, T is time, and the other T is type or mode of exercise. And for now, we're interested in this I for the exercise intensity. So how hard is someone working out? That's what we're trying to describe. What's the intensity that someone is doing cardio workout? And it could be heart rates, and that's a relatively simple and easy way to measure exercise intensity. And we have a lab on measuring heart rates and at what percent of max or what percent of a heart rate reserve are different exercise intensities. It could also be power, and we had a short video of measuring power and how to sort of calculate power. So you could ask somebody to, in this case, bike at a certain power output. As I mentioned in the short video, we have some stride power meters. So you actually could ask someone to run at a certain power output if they had a stride power meter. So ways to prescribe exercise intensity, heart rates, and power. Another way that we've already described briefly is looking at the rate of perceived exertion. So a scale typically from 6 to 20 on how difficult the individual feels that this exercise is. And more of a subjective rating, but it still would be a measurement of exercise intensity. What I want to describe now is looking at the lactate threshold that was previously called an anaerobic threshold, and that's not exactly correct. So we will call it the lactate threshold. It also is sometimes called OBLA, or the onset of blood lactate. There's maybe some pretty specific definitions of what this means, but either lactate threshold or maybe simply threshold or the onset of blood lactate. And in the lab, we can measure this blood lactate. We have a portable blood lactate analyzer, sort of like a glucose analyzer, where a small droplet of blood will go on this stick or this piece of paper that has some chemicals on it. It's then inserted into the analyzer, and after 10 or 15 seconds, a concentration of blood lactate is shown on this screen. We also have a more accurate desktop blood lactate analyzer. This takes a little bit larger sample of blood, and it's a little more sensitive and in terms of measuring a blood lactate, although it takes a little more work and some little more work to get a sample and to do calibrations for this analyzer. But these can be measured in the lab, or it can be measured out in the field. And typically blood lactates are measured as a concentration. So this is a typical graph where here's blood lactate on the y-axis, and it's a concentration, so it's millimoles per liter. And then this would be exercise intensity on the horizontal x-axis. And as that exercise intensity increases, so here it's being measured as a percent of VO2 max, blood lactate stays relatively constant, the blood lactate concentration, but at some point there's this exponential rise in blood lactate. And sort of how quickly it goes up or how much it goes up, there's some pretty specific definitions, but where you see it going up, as shown in this graph, that would be called the lactate threshold, and it's a marker for exercise intensity. And there's some misconceptions about that. The misconception is that it was thought that when we saw this increase in lactic acid or lactate officially in the blood, that was a marker for a lack of oxygen in the muscle cells. And so I found this online, and this is actually looking at lifting weights, but here, this is a quote from someone who was lifting. So I don't feel lactic acid burn during workouts while lifting weights. I don't feel any burn. I increase my loads and I keep my sets 8 to 12 to failure. I can't do another even if it would be $1 million. In other words, I lift to failure, but all I feel is fatigue and no burn. And this lactic acid, I mean, it sounds like an acid that it would be causing this burning, and I mean, that's not the case. And it's pretty subjective, right? So how one person feels during fatigue or due to an increase in blood lactate is different than how another person may feel. So it's hard to know what is really going on with this individual. And even though it's called lactic acid, and that does sound like it's going to be burning something, actually the acid portion of that lactic acid is almost immediately broken apart. It's almost immediately dissociated. So now what is left over is a 3-carbon lactate molecule. And this lactate molecule can be shuttled around the body and actually be used for energy. So it can be shuttled around through the blood and go to different muscle fibers. Here, if we have a muscle fiber producing lactate, so here is an open fiber, and so it's producing lactate, and actually some relatively new research is that this lactate can go to a neighboring oxidative fiber that could take up that lactate and be used for energy. It also can go around the body and be taken up by a separate muscle fiber and used for energy. It can be taken up by the heart muscle used for energy. It can be taken up by the liver and be stored as, actually being stored as glycogen. Here's another sort of picture describing that. Here is a fast glycolytic fiber that is producing lactate. It can go to a neighboring oxidative fiber where it can be used by the mitochondria to make energy. It also can be sent out into the bloodstream, be used by the muscle of the heart. The heart muscle as a fuel, and continue on with the circulation and be used by a separate oxidative fiber. So this is called the lactate shuttle, and this lactate can be used as an energy source. So the misconceptions, this high lactic acid is not caused by a lack of oxygen. And the acidic portion of this lactic acid is almost immediately dissociated. So we're left with lactate, and that lactate molecule can be shuttled around the body and be used for fuel. This lactic acid, even though it sounds like it's burning something, the acid portion is dissociated, and so that's not causing muscle fatigue or burn. It is true that that if muscle cells and blood pH becomes too acidic, that is associated with fatigue, but there's other metabolic acids being produced, not just lactic acid. And you may remember from an exercise physiology class, DOMS stands for delayed onset muscle soreness. And so if someone is lifting weights, and especially if they're lifting a lot of weights or emphasizing the eccentric portion of weightlifting, the next day their muscles could be sore. That's the next day. Lactic acid and even lactate, it's gone pretty quickly. So the acidic portion, as we've said, is dissociated, and the lactate portion is being sent around the body, and pretty quickly it either is used by a fuel source or it goes to the liver where it can be stored as glycogen. You'll still see online, you'll still have patients or clients that will be talking about this lactic acid, and there's still misconceptions out there about what is this lactic acid. This graph that I showed earlier, it measures blood lactate concentration. So that's how many moles in this case, or millimoles of lactate in a liter, or I don't know. It's an amount. It's an amount or a concentration of lactate in a given volume of blood. That is a simple concentration, and I tried to have you think with this next picture that's only really part of the story. So this middle rectangle is lactate in the blood. This is what we can measure in our lab with a portable lactate analyzer or our lab lactate analyzer. It is a concentration in the blood, in this volume in the blood. But what's going on in the blood and how much is in the blood, it's equal to how much is coming into the blood. So how quickly we're making lactate and sending it into the blood. And also how quickly lactate is being removed from the blood and being sent to the liver or sent to another muscle cell. So just by measuring what's in the blood is not the complete story, because we're making lactate and we're also getting rid of lactate. So this very simple diagram sort of describes the lactate that's coming into the blood and the lactate that's removed. And if these two arrows are equal, then the amount in the blood is going to be equal. If we're exercising really hard, yeah, we're making more. We're not making more because there's less oxygen. We're making more because we need more energy. So we're doing more glycolysis. We're making more, breaking down more glucose. So we're going to be making more lactate. And endurance-trained athletes, they're better at removing lactate from the blood. So this arrow would be bigger. So this very simple diagram gives us an explanation of sort of the amount coming in and the amount leaving. And it used to be called anaerobic threshold, and we won't use that anymore because anaerobic implies a lack of oxygen, and that's actually not the case. And this lactate shuttle, as I described in pictures, it's the movement or shuttling lactate from a site of production around the body where lactate can be used as an energy source, or it can go to the liver and be stored as glycogen. So this is called the lactate shuttle. And lactate and lactate concentration can be one marker of exercise intensity. And there are other ways to measure exercise intensity, like heart rates, power, a rating of perceived exertion, or if you have a lactate analyzer with its limitations, if you have a lactate analyzer, it can give you a concentration of lactate in the blood as a measurement of exercise intensity. So this short video was a description of exercise intensity and looking at this FIT principle and the I for the intensity of the exercise.